In the last video, we have seen asynchronous callbacks in JavaScript. In this video, we're going to learn about promises. By the end of this video, I promise you that you'll have a good understanding of promises in JavaScript, as we're going to answer three main questions, which are: what are promises, how do they work, and why do we need them? But for now, let's play the intro first. So even though the concept of promises is a new concept, it has been officially introduced into JavaScript in the ES6 version. Promises in JavaScript are mainly used to manage asynchronous operations in your code. And if you don't know what asynchronous JavaScript is, please make sure to watch the first video in this series and then come back here again to follow along with us. So to have a good understanding of what the promises concept is all about, I'd want you to play by the rules of the JavaScript engine for a while in the following scenario. But first remember, rules are: you're allowed to perform only one task at a time and in order, and you can't do any input-output operation by yourself. Now the scenario is as follows. Let's assume that you've been given to perform a task of making a call to a friend, to ask him about today's weather, and then to perform another task of drinking a cup of coffee. So the first thing you do, you take your phone, you enter the number of your friend, then you press the call button. Till now, all this stuff you can do them by yourself. But watch out, here is the thing. As soon as you have pressed the call button, you have no control over how the call is done, and there is something happening in the background that you're ignorant about. And all you get is a tone indicating that your call is in progress. In other words, you are getting a promise from your mobile network operator that they are working on your call. And obviously, because you're playing by the JavaScript engine rules and you got another task to perform, so you won't wait, you just take their promise into consideration and you move on to perform the next action, which is drinking a cup of coffee. Meanwhile, the mobile operator is working on your promise. And by the end of their work on the promise, there will be two possible outcomes. Whether your friend is going to pick up the phone and you can ask him about today's weather, or something wrong will happen, and as a result, you won't be able to ask him. So the same principle applies when it comes to promises in JavaScript. They are a kind of guarantee that allow you to manage asynchronous calls and control the flow of your programs efficiently upon them. I hope that this analogy has helped you a little bit to understand the general concept behind promises. Now let's have a look at what the MDN docs state about promises. They say the promise object represents the eventual completion or failure of an asynchronous operation and its resulting value. And this translates what we've been talking about in our last analogy. Now let's jump into the code editor to see how do promises in JavaScript look like and how do they work. As we can see in this example, a promise object can be created using the constructor that gets a function as an argument. This function is called the executor function, and it always automatically and synchronously runs when you create a brand new promise object. And to demonstrate this, let's run the code. We see that the message execution is printed, which means that this function gets run each time we create a new promise. Now you might ask about resolve and reject arguments that are passed to the executor function. These are two callbacks provided by JavaScript that we can use and call them in order to resolve the promise in case of success or reject the promise in case of failure. Let's assume that we want this promise to always resolve with the value of 1. All we can do is call in the resolve callback with the number 1 as argument. And if we console log p, notice that we're getting a promise object with the status resolved. And if we expand the object, we'll see that it has also a value property, which in this case holds the number 1. Basically, a promises object have two properties: the status property, which defines the status of the promise, and its value can be whether pending, and this is the initial value, or fulfilled in case of success or rejected in case of failure. Note that the promise that is fulfilled or rejected is often set settled. The value property, in the other hand, represents the resolved value of the promise and holds undefined initially any value if the promise is fulfilled, or the reason of failure if it's rejected. Promises represent a proxy for a value which can be get at some point in the future. That's why the promise object defines the then method that is called whenever the promise is resolved or rejected. This method takes up to two arguments that can be defined by the programmer. One callback to handle the success and another callback to handle the failure, as we can see in this example. If we run this code, the success callback will be invoked, as the promise always resolves, and therefore the message success with the value 1 is printed. To end this section of the lesson, I want to share with you this quote from the MDN docs. They state that In an ideal world, all asynchronous functions would already return promises. And one example of this kind of function is the fetch API that if you've already worked with, you for sure knew that it returns a promise. Actually, we will look at how we use the fetch API in a separate video in the future. Now the question is, why would someone use promises in first place? If you've already watched the previous video about asynchronous callbacks in JavaScript, we have talked about the pitfall called callback hell, which makes our code hard to read and maintain. So promises provide to us a mechanism called chaining, which makes of our code to be more cleaner and easy to handle. To demonstrate this, let's replicate the same example of the last video and try to use promises instead of callbacks. So notice that instead of nesting functions, we are chaining them through the then method and still get the same result, however in much cleaner way this time. Another benefit of using promises is the ease of handling errors, by whether providing a second callback to the then method to handle the failure, as we've seen in the previous example, or using another method called the catch method, which will be called whenever a promise is rejected or an error has occurred. And to demonstrate this, let's take the same example and add the catch method to it. And instead of resolving the promise with the data, let's reject it with the reason. Now if we run the code, the reason of failure is going to be catched through the catch method, and therefore server is down is printed to the console. One more last thing to emphasize concerning promises is that callback handlers are always called asynchronously, which means that they will wait for the synchronous code to finish before they get executed. Hold on, we're not done yet. Believe it or not, there is a much simpler syntax than chaining with the then method to write a much cleaner and easy to read code. In fact, in the next video, we'll be looking at the async await feature in JavaScript. Thanks for watching and see you soon.